All right. Distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Ambassador Pillai, our chairman, and the entire ISAS community of researchers and administrators, I'm delighted to have you all with us for this very important conversation today. We have a triple advantage of having with us a first-class research problem, which is India's foreign policy and the Modi Doctrine. Is there such a thing, and does it play a role in India's foreign policy? And a book which claims to answer our query. The book is called The Modi Doctrine, New Paradigms in India's Foreign Policy. And the advantage is that we have Mr. Vijay Chatawale, one of the editors, and a panel of experts which is remarkably complementary in terms of their complementing one another. If they will complement one another, we'll see afterwards. Because the panel they're all well-known analysts, but among other things, we have an actor, a professor, and an observer. Because Vijayji is in charge of the Foreign Affairs Department of the BJP and is a former Vice President of the Torrent Pharmaceutical Limited, India. A remarkable combination of, as far as science would go, he's a microbiologist and a PhD, and a real professional in the sense that he quit a lucrative career to become what Max Weber would call a professional politician, because he is engaged in connecting to the international Indian diaspora. Professor Rajamohan is director of Carnegie India, and among other things, he is also a research professor at NUS and one of my colleagues here, and a member of India's National Security Advisory. He was. And the third member of this panel is, as I said, observer, because he has observed what matters most, the corporate world from Mumbai. After 5 years in Mumbai, where he was the bureau chief of the well-known IT, the newspaper. He is now a visiting fellow at the LKY School of Public Policy, and as he claims, he's on sabbatical from his previous position at the FT. He's writing a book at the moment on India, but will not tell me what the book is about.
I'm pretty happy to tell you.
If we have a first-class problem, a book that should answer our query, and a first-class panel, what we don't have is time. This is Singapore, so our panelists have agreed to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then there will be question and answer session. But I'm hoping the audience, the questions, and the answers will all spill over next door, where coffee, tea, and snacks will be provided. I hope you'll stay engaged in this very engaging debate. I would like to take a few more minutes because time is limited, and we are, being a think tank, we are very, very keen to put this conversation to its most effective use in terms of generating knowledge that would be of value to Singapore, to our stakeholders, to the two ministries, and to NUS, because among other things, besides being a think tank, we are also a research institute. We are expected to make contribution to first-class research. For that, it is very important to make sure that the terms of this discourse are clear to start with. I mean, that India's Prime Minister Modi is making sensations all over the world is well known. Whether he wants it or not, he's there. That foreign policy has turned a corner is reasonably well known. What is not reasonably well known is whether there is a Modi doctrine, because it's not clear what a doctrine is. Is it a Panchamrita, as one of the authors and editors of this book claims, combining some sort of 5 nice things, or a revamped Panchamrita of the Nehruvian type, Panchashila? Is it merely aspirational, or as international relations specialists would call it, cheap talk, meaning talk which is meant to fend off the adversities and do something else behind? So, what is a doctrine, and how shall we measure the doctrineness of the Modi doctrine? I looked it up and found something that I could generalize from 3 doctrines: the Monroe Doctrine, the Brezhnev Doctrine, and the new benevolent doctrine of the responsibility to protect. I found 3 commonalities. The Monroe Doctrine said quite grandly that no European power should colonize the newly independent Spanish colonies in Latin America. So the United States would not tolerate a European nation colonizing an independent nation in North or South America. Similarly, the Brezhnev Doctrine declared quite grandly that the Soviet Union reserved the right to intervene wherever there is a danger to socialism from counter-revolutionary forces. Who will judge if the so-called threat is a counter-revolutionary threat? Of course, the Soviet Union. So, the Soviet Union would be both judge, jury, and executioner all at the same time. Who would decide if there is an attempt to colonize a newly independent Latin American country? Of course, the United States. Similarly, the more problematic doctrine of the responsibility to protect, 2009, becomes a thinly disguised attempt to make sure that the Western establishment would decide that democracy is safe, that in the name of this doctrine, they would be allowed, or they would allow themselves to engage in regime change without calling it an external intervention. So, what is in common among these 3? First of all, there should be some value consensus as to what is the core of this doctrine. Independence of Latin American countries, the protection of vulnerable people, protection of nascent socialism, all sound like very nice altruistic ideas. So there has to be a bunch of ideas. Number 2, behind this shared vision, there will have to be a strategy to implement those ideas, and of course, enough power to make sure that this area which falls under the doctrine is protected from external forces. So, let's go home now over to India and see if there is such a doctrine. If there is, what are its core ideas? Is there a strategy to implement those ideas and enough power to protect those ideas? If not, we'll have to then say that what goes by the name of a doctrine is actually an aspiration and not a reality. This is then, as a political scientist, my criterion for measuring the doctrineness of a doctrine. Why it matters to political science or public policy is something that should be already clear. A doctrine is a signaling device. If you have a doctrine, your adversaries who are engaged with you in a conversation would know exactly what you mean, that you mean what you say and say what you mean. Without that, it becomes slightly ambiguous. When you are sending out ambiguous signals, the adversaries can't quite make out. But the rub of the matter is, doctrine is also a form of power in an implicit way. You can call it a soft power. As long as the doctrine holds, the holder of power does not even have to impose his will It is imposed almost by structure. Another doctrine, the doctrine of the caste system. As long as it holds, the lower caste would automatically bow their heads. The body language would show who has power and who is subject to that power. This is why doctrines are so important to students of international politics. So, with this, these introductory remarks, I'll now hand ourselves over to the panel. We'll start with Dr. Vijay. He has very generously sent me a few points, which I would now invite him to share with the audience.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. As you must have noticed from my introduction that I am an odd man out here, in the sense that I don't have any formal education in foreign policy. I came from physical science, and it is more an accident than a design that I landed in what I am doing today. But sometimes accidents are pleasant. When we started working on this book, in fact, we didn't think a lot about title, and as the material gathered, then we realized that some constant theme is emerging out of whatever all the experts have written. Even though I represent a political party and other editor also represent the same party, BJP, we were very conscious that we should evaluate whatever Prime Minister Modi has done in 2 years' time should be evaluated and judged by the experts and not by the party functionaries. Therefore, if you see the list of contributors, barring an exception of one or two, most of them are outside the party purview and they are real experts in their field. And while discussing with many of these contributors, we realized that there is some constant theme is emerging, and therefore we decided to give this very ambitious title of the Modi Doctrine. Even though the title says that there is a Modi Doctrine, we are very aware that this is an emerging concept. And this is not something which is, because time is short, 2 years is not something in the foreign policy where the historians will try to evaluate it differently, but in the contemporary people should be careful and say that this is something very iron cast, very formative doctrine. The second part is, no foreign policy can be otherwise also remain in iron cast and very rigid because of the dynamics of world around us. But there are some constant themes, and those themes are, of course, some of them are civilizational and some of them are political. For example, India has continuously talked about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means entire world is family, and that's not mere slogan for us, but it is something we really cherish. Prime Minister Modi, even before he became Prime Minister, talked about climate justice rather than climate change, which according to him that the climate change affects most to the poor and downtrodden, and therefore we need to talk about climate justice. He has also talked about conflict avoidance rather than conflict management. So these are some of the things which are enshrined in Indian value system, and we are not at all very shy of accepting that we have taken it from our heritage. But then there are a lot of things which will remain dynamic, sometimes proactively and sometimes reactively, changing global conditions. To put in a nutshell, let me quote from our External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj when she delivered a talk while releasing his book, and I quote, "After coming to power in 2014, in looking out at the world, there was also a growing feeling that we would contribute more and shape its future. Consequently, our government came in with more ambitious goals, bolder policies to achieve them, and a commitment to more effective delivery. 2 years later, much progress has been made. In addressing the external aspects of this endeavor, it is important to stress the linkage between domestic and foreign policy. It is not just that the policy and priorities are articulated differently from the past. At the heart of the change is a vision of India's place in the world, its relationship with the international community, and indeed an understanding of rapidly transforming world itself." So with this little blog, let me highlight 5 or 6 points of emerging Modi doctrine so that it starts a good discussion. First of all, as emphasized by Sushma ji, the first part is we have very tight integration of domestic and industrial and international policies, and it may go with the flagship themes of Prime Minister Modi like Make in India, Digital India, and even social initiatives like Clean India, building toilets for women. And you won't believe that Prime Minister talks about it even on the international platforms. Investment is only one part of it, but whatever we want to do domestically, today our international policy is also working in the same direction, and that is one important aspect. Second part is what we call it as overcoming hesitations of history. In past, we were not doing certain things because we were hesitant to do, either because of external pressures or because of the internal vote bank politics. For example, we rightly supported Palestine cause. Rightly, I am emphasizing that. But deliberately avoided having very high level contacts with Israel simply because of the vote bank politics. But today we are managing the competing and sometimes conflicting interests, and in a very delicate manner. For example, Prime Minister Modi visited Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are on the poles apart on several issues in a very short period of time. In both countries he received the awards, civilian awards. We have the best relations possible with the UAE, and at the same time we have building new bridges and building new relationship with Israel. Third is that we reaching the unreached. Historically, if you see, there were several important countries where bilateral meetings did not happen for decades, and it includes many important countries like Canada, UAE, and to list a few. So all these countries have been now not only reached, but strong bonds have been developed in last 2 years. Sushma Swaraj herself have met dignitaries of more than 100 countries at various platforms. And now there are apparently 68 countries where no senior minister has visited for last several years, and this government has taken an initiative that by December end, at least one cabinet minister will visit these countries by the end of the year. And in all, we think that by the end of this year, all 192 countries will be visited by at least one minister, and this is something which is unheard of in Indian history. The next point is India's leadership role, and it is not only in the diplomatic level but also in the COP21 conference in France. We approached and we put forward the International Solar Alliance, which was endorsed by almost all the major countries. When Prime Minister Modi appealed for Yoga Day, International Yoga Day, almost all the countries have wholeheartedly supported it. And also on the diplomatic front, when we raised the issue of human rights in Balochistan on 15th of August speech by Prime Minister Modi, a lot of people even within India were very skeptical that whether this will work or not. But in last 2 months, if you see, there are voices against the atrocities of Pakistan army in Balochistan in various parts of country, from US, Canada, till Europe, the UK, and also Australia. Next and most important part is the civilizational connect, which I don't have to emphasize. With Prime Minister Modi visit to Mongolia, in the very historical and heritage places in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, even the islands like Fiji, where he met with all the small countries, and these civilized Mauritius visit, and all that has revitalized our civilizational connect. One most important part of it, and which is very close to my heart also because I am actually involved in this, the interaction with Indian diaspora. Indian diaspora so far has been taken as more or less thing for granted, and at the election time an ATM machine. But Prime Minister Modi, with his outreach program, which happened now in close to 15 countries, one of them here also in Singapore, and I was fortunate to attend more than 10 of them and was involved in the organizing. What we found is that if there is a larger goal and larger theme, the diaspora can come together, and also they get new sense of identity and new stature in their own country. It has also resulted into significant investment back in the both social sector as well as business sector back in India. And last but not least is the latest strategic surgical strike where Indian Army has entered into cross line of control and destroyed the terrorist launching pad, has shown that we are now overcoming what is broadly called as strategic strengths. So these are some of the themes which are emerging in the Modi Doctrine. Of course, there are a lot of challenges. Our neighbors in the north as well as neighbors in the west do pose some challenges. Not everything in the international platform will go as per our dictum, but we are going assertively and positively in this direction. That much I would like to say, and rest we can elaborate when we discuss. Thank you very much.
Vijay, thank you very much for the comprehensive description of the various policies that are associated with Prime Minister Modi. But if those policies constitute a distinctive doctrine in terms of the binding values, strategy and power remains an open question. I will now go over to Professor Raja Mohan to continue the discussion further.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Let me begin by congratulating Mr. Choudhary for bringing on this volume. Because when I first heard about this volume, I thought this was going to be a general hagiography of the new Prime Minister, particularly since one of the well-known party figures is associated with it. As you know that in India we have a very enduring tradition of praising the emperor. In Sanskritic tradition it's called stotra, meaning that there is a whole culture of how well can you describe the emperor and his great qualities. That's been very well established tradition. Similarly, even the Persian, the Mughal period as well. The tarif, what you say in Persian, the praise of the sultan, praise of the king was a very important. How well you did it. Because Persian was very stylized language, so there's a long tradition of actually praising the sovereign. It didn't matter who the sovereign was. There's always a new sovereign, at least in India, every 5 years. So praising the sovereign is a tradition. But I think my pleasant surprise that in this book really was a complete opposite of what I thought it would be. By bringing in well-known experts from around the world to reflect on 2 years of Modi's foreign policy, I think was an impressive achievement, both in terms of actually getting so many scholars to contribute to this discussion. So I would say it's a very good effort, and I hope at the end of the 5 years we'll have a more comprehensive assessment. By the time the directions that we've seen develop in the last few years would have matured. What I thought I'll do is really to complement some of the things that the editor and author has already said. That I think one way of understanding the importance of what Modi is doing, whether we call it a doctrine or on the stage, is to recognize the context in which it has appeared. So I would say this really probably the third phase in ways India's engagement in the world since independence. I think what happened in the first phase, just at the time of independence, three things happened which set the tone for India's engagement with the world in at least the first 40 years, which is, I would say, roughly from 47 to 1991. Three things were, one was the dramatic shift in India's economic orientation. Here was a country of extended tradition of commerce, trade and commerce across the seas, whether it was the Gujaratis or whether it was the Marwadis or the Sindhis or the Chettiars in Tamil Nadu. There was a long tradition of Indian capital reaching out to the world and trading with them. What the independent India did under Nehru was to shut this down. That in the name of self-reliance, in the name of an alternative economic model, India's expansive globalization under the Raj, in fact, while Raj had a number of problems, the Raj was a phase of India's expansive globalization in the 19th century, where Indian business, Indian capital, Indian soldiers, Indian ideas actually spread around the world under the shadow of the empire, but nevertheless they connected with the world, and I think many parts of Malaya, Singapore, Africa, east coast of Africa today continue to reflect the globalization of India. But I think this was reversed. I think quite clearly, by choice, by grand design, that we said, look, we're going to cut ourselves off. That automatically shrank India's footprint in the global stage. The volume of its trade, once you change your economy, it decides who your friends are. The markets that if you're not interested in the export markets, that automatically reduces the importance of countries. And the kind of engagement you did was largely defined by the socialist, state-led socialism of Nehru. I mean, whatever the other rhetoric might have been, this was the fundamental. The second fundamental, I think, at the time of independence was the rupture with the West. That 150 years of Indian people and British capital working together produced a set of outcomes that you saw when we talk about the British power. It was not Britain, had nothing. Britain was nothing without the Indian power added to it, Indian resources, Indian people, the Indian army. That this partnership which produced outcomes to make Britain the world's largest, the most important power at that point in time, that ended in the interwar period. Just as when Indian nationalism grew, the way Britain dealt with it, and the way the Second World War emerged, and the contradictions then became irreconcilable, and India felt that, look, it had to take a stand against the West, and that defined quite a bit of India's approach to the world, that it needed to distance itself from the West, and I think partly that was a huge problem. The third problem, or even a tragedy, was the partition of the subcontinent. The division of the subcontinent, which was one of the largest territorial entities under the Raj, along the lines of religion, and in a short span of 3 weeks, produced a set of outcomes, including new borders, new conflicts, new internal divisions, and I think coping with this conflict within the subcontinent became one of the central preoccupations of India's foreign policy. That even today, of course, Pakistan and India, they have all the characteristics of separate countries, and Bangladesh or Bengal. But in some ways, it's also a civil war, in a sense, the unresolved problem, the residual bitter legacies of partition that continue to put the countries in the region in conflict. And I think overcoming that has been a huge preoccupation for India. I think what we saw in 1991, the second phase, was really an attempt to overcome some of these contradictions. The economic model changed from a closed economy to an open economy. That in turn meant you were going to be more friends with the West, because Western markets, Western capital were more welcome, which it was not before 1991. probably threw out the Coca-Cola was all right. Now it's all in retrospect, but throwing the IBM out, it tells you something what India was doing in the 70s. I was a student of JN in those days. We were looking for a computer. We tried to get it from Bulgaria. Bulgaria was the socialist division of labor. They had the computing side of it from the Russians. Now, with that kind of a record, I think what we saw in 1990 was a clear change of direction. But what happened in 1991 was the ambivalence was that the direction of change was there, but it was not decisive. We had a series of weak leaders, all running coalition governments. Even the strongest of them, the Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee, were constrained severely by coalition politics, and therefore the intent to change was clear, the direction was new, but the achievements remained significantly limited. I think that's what is changing under the government of the last 2.5 years. That this is a new direction, is not just a new direction, but I think it comes with a number of advantages, I think, for the present Prime Minister. One is age. When you're celebrating a man who's 64 years old as young, I mean, you had to know what came before him. Nobody was below 70 before that, or not 80. That you have actually a Prime Minister who can attend 10 meetings a day and not 2. And afternoons you have to take rest. I mean, from that, what we've had for 30 years, to actually have someone energetic and has the push to engage on a basis both internally and externally is a huge change. I think that partly gets translated into where we conduct diplomacy. There's a new intensity, the new energy, and the new enthusiasm. The second important thing, I think he has advantages which his predecessor did not have, which is a majority in the lower house of the parliament, and largely a party that has been supportive on foreign policy. So irrespective, while Manmohan Singh did not have that luxury, where I think many of Manmohan Singh's initiatives were trumped by Sonia Gandhi, whether it was in relation to Pakistan, the nuclear deal with the United States. While here at least, whatever a lot of us suspected, maybe it won't be simple, but we've seen a significant support from the party, which is very important for a prime minister in a democracy. So besides those, in terms of substance, I would say 4-5 things. I think Doctor has covered quite a bit of the point. So let me just mention a few things. One, I think the whole question of the historic hesitations that the hesitation towards the West, when Prime Minister stands up in the US Congress, an Indian Prime Minister who's supposed to be more anti-American than the Russian Prime Minister or the Chinese Prime Minister, for I don't know for what reason, but nevertheless that is the general image, to say India's hesitations of history are over. I think he was laying down a marker and also summing up the extraordinary change that had taken place in India's relationship with the United States. Not just with the US, with the West as a whole, with Britain or Australia, countries that we deliberately kept at a distance, largely became today important partners for India. So I think that's a very important change that is brought about. The second important thing I think that is brought about, attitude to the foreign capital. That even in the reform era, the fear of foreign capital, the fear of the East India Company, and the fear that the outsiders are going to take you down, which is so deep on the left and the right, I might say so. The CPM and sometimes the RSS have had similar positions on foreign capital. I think Modi probably single-handedly, in fact many of the initial reforms were actually about lifting the restrictions on foreign capital, and that's been one of the major reforms. That essentially saying, look, India is a large country with a large size, that it can leverage its position, that having traded for centuries, having had a tradition of business, that you don't have to see yourself as a weak third world state, that you can actually deal with the outside world on a strong basis. I think that new confidence, I think, is an important shift, and that's why we've seen actually dramatic expansion of foreign capital in India in the last 2 years. The fourth aspect I would say is in relation to China. That the traditional policies, I think India's policies were couched in deference to the Chinese, but fear of them internally. But I think what Prime Minister Modi has shown in the last 2 years, look, you can deal with the Chinese, you can play hardball, and yet you can also balance them. I think no other Prime Minister has fought the Indian security system. Security system, say liberalizing visas for the Chinese. Previous governments feigned friendship with the Chinese, but no Chinese would get a visa to India, that too on a second time. I mean, to get a multiple entry visa for the Chinese was so hard that actually you have here Prime Minister saying, we are going to look, you can't treat the Chinese as the second largest economy in this this manner, and that China can be a source of capital and source of India's development. That does not mean you accept what they do in relation to other things where it features together. So I think first time getting the balance right with China, competition, yes, cooperation, yes, but it will be done on India's own terms, and that it is not going to be defined by some preset ideological consideration. The fourth point I would say is in the neighborhood. I think the neighborhood first has been talked about, but I would say this whole emphasis on finding the solutions to the Pakistan issue. You've seen it, some people have called it flip-flops, but the fact is I think what Modi has been trying to do is to find a way to solve the Pakistan problem. Invitation for Nawaz Sharif, landing in Lahore on one side. On the other hand, the recent attack and across the terror bags. I think all the previous prime ministers have struggled with this, but I think Prime Minister Modi is trying to find a different way of engaging the Pakistan problem, and I think that's been an important contribution. But I think this is unresolved business. But I would say the credibility of this effort to overcome partition is reflected most in the case of Bangladesh. That the Congress party negotiated a boundary agreement with Bangladesh, but did not have the political courage to sign those agreements. And it is Modi, I mean, when we knew very clearly, you can confirm it, sir, that the BJP units in Assam and Bengal were completely opposed to that agreement. But here is an Indian Prime Minister who stands in Guwahati in the middle of an in a party cadre meeting, public meeting, saying resolution of the boundary dispute is in India's interest. Coming from a BJP Prime Minister, when there was a clear opposition within the party, to make that case that look, Bangladesh is going to be a very special partner. Therefore, we got to do this. It didn't matter because I remember Mr. Jaitley stood up in the parliament in the previous government and said this is unconstitutional. But luckily for us, I mean, I think he was in Gujarat and he was not associated with the kind of policies that the previous leadership of the BJP did. So I think it tells you something about the commitment to overcome partition, and I think that is a very important. The last point on SAARC, we just had the BIMSTEC meeting, the South and Southeast Asia connection. But I would say most of the previous governments were willing to live with the fact that Pakistan was blocking SAARC's progress. There was nothing you could do. What Mr. Modi has done, look, if Pakistan is not ready for SAARC, we are ready to go for a two-speed SAARC. Sub-regional, in the BBI process, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, or trans-regional process with the BIMSTEC, with Southeast Asia. And I think it is this attempt at pushing the regional integration with or without Pakistan, which I think has defined his approach, which again I think leads me to the last point, which is essentially, if you define your objectives clearly and combine it with the notion of problem solving. That solve problem is not about taking positions. Indians love taking positions on all global issues, but actually of solving problems that exist for us, of taking things off the table so that India gets freer, more purposeful in its engagement with the world. So I'll stop this.
Thanks very much. The book describes Modi's doctrine as a new paradigm in India's foreign policy. You have raised the issue at the level of how distinctive is it, how cohesive is it, how purposeful is it, and how powerful is it. And if one thinks of foreign policy as an iceberg, then what is underwater? What gives it power? That certainly would contribute greatly to the conversation to follow. I'll now turn towards Mr. James Crabtree to close the formal part of the presentation.
Very good, thank you very much. I'll be as brief as I can. I thought it was interesting, Vijay, that you said you felt like the odd one out here, but my background is also predominantly as an analyst of business and economics rather than foreign policy. That's what I wrote about for the FT, although I've been doing a little more here. I've also just come back from the BRICS summit, where I felt like an odd man out in a different way, given that I was chairing a session with some of the BRICS finance ministers and looked around and discovered that I was the only Westerner in the room, and given an immediate taste of the way the world is moving. Now have substantive discussions about global affairs in which my lot are basically not invited at all. Let me say three quick things to contribute to what's already been said while echoing congratulations on the book, Vijay, which I apologize for saying that I haven't yet read, but look forward to. The first, I think, is that, as Raja said, while I'll come down and say that there isn't such a thing as a Modi doctrine, I mean, I think if you, from my understanding of how you define these things, doctrines tend to be clear, simple principles like the Powell Doctrine or the Monroe Doctrine, and they also tend to be articulated by the people in whose name they stand, and neither of those two things has happened in Modi's cases yet. So I think we can say that there isn't a Modi Doctrine, although one may be working towards it. What you can say, I think, is that the world has woken up to the new assertiveness that Mr. Modi has brought to Indian foreign policy, that the old world of sort of slightly grouchy non-alignment has been comprehensively left behind, and that you can see this much more visible and assertive diplomacy across a range of areas. I mean, the way the response to the Pakistani incursion has been managed is only the latest, but there's a whole range of areas in which India's diplomacy appears to be much more active within its own region and globally in its relationship with the US, with the Western powers, also in sort of bilateral and trilateral relationships around this region, the way that it's been developing stronger ties with Japan, with Australia, with Vietnam, many in response to China. There's a whole host of things in which diplomacy has become more active under this administration, but I think it's important to recognize that this is not simply a consequence of Modi and those around him. It's partially a consequence of economic growth, and I thought Raja gave a rather masterful sort of long-term tableau of the re-globalization of India's economy and how dramatically reintegrated India has become in the global system. At the time of the reforms in 1991, India's trade in goods and services to GDP was about 17% of the size of its economy. It's now over 50, which means relative to the size of its economy, India is a far more globalized economy than America or really any other large economy. It's more than China if you tally up goods and services. It's been a dramatic change in the structure of India's economy. And also simply because of the geopolitics of the region, that even if Mr. Modi hadn't become more active, India's value as a partner has gone up dramatically. You see this all, I mean, I'm a newcomer to Singapore and ASEAN. We've been living here only for 6 months, but you see all of the countries of ASEAN are looking towards India as a strategic counterweight to China. It's all perfectly obvious. You can see this in the papers almost all the time. And so even if Mr. Modi hadn't become more sort of assertive, India's sort of value as a strategic partner would have gone up simply because of other things that are happening around the region. And this has two consequences, I suppose, one good, one bad. One is that this gives you, if you're India, more room to play with, but on the other hand, it makes it rather more difficult, given the geopolitical context, to execute what in the Chinese case was called a quiet rise, that crucial period in the 20, 30 years after you begin opening up your economy, in which what you want to do is have an abnormal period of super high growth, 8, 10%. You don't want that to be complicated by sort of geopolitical tensions that dent your growth. And in India's case, that's just going to be more difficult than in China's case because of the context in which it finds itself. So second point is about the relationship that India has within its region. In the end, if India wants to move from, to be a leading power in the words of Foreign Secretary Jaishankar, to eventually being a great power, what it primarily needs is to be dominant within a region which isn't particularly troublesome. And that, as anyone can see, is rather difficult. It isn't simply because, as Raja said, there have been some very positive developments, the relationship with Bangladesh, for instance, but dotted around the region, not just in Pakistan, there's all sorts of problems that India faces, not least of which, as I'll get onto, is sort of balancing the relationship with China within South Asia. And I would argue, I used to cover Sri Lanka for the FT, I would argue a whole host of missed opportunities. And even though Mr. Modi has become much more active, taking trips to East Africa, diplomacy with the island nations of the Indian Ocean, beginning a sort of incoherent but rather interesting attempt to rebrand India's regional presence towards a framework around the Indian Ocean. Nonetheless, the ability to use, in a sense, Indian financial muscle to win friends around the region is still in its very early stages. If you look at a country like Sri Lanka, which when it had its change of government, when the Rajapaktas were kicked out and the new regime came in, it was seemed to me pretty wide open that if India had gone in there with its pocketbook open and sort of given the Sri Lankans what they needed in terms of financing and infrastructure investment, then it would have been quite easy, or relatively easy, to bring the Sri Lankans more closely into sort of India's orbit, but that didn't happen, and so Mr. Wickremesinghe is now back in Beijing attempting to kind of get more money out of the Chinese, and so on and so forth. So I suppose the point is that India's region remains problematic, even out with Pakistan, and that while this attempt that those close to Mr. Modi are beginning to push about the sort of Indian Ocean geopolitical concept is interesting, at the moment it's conceptually interesting, but it doesn't have much teeth in it, and that I think will be a kind of test. The third thing is, it remains unclear to me what India's attitude is to the sort of the global order, the liberal global order that people in the West fret about a lot. Mr. Jaishankar again says India welcomes the move to multilateralism, which is fine. I mean, this is going to happen anyway. But what type and what character of multilateralism India wants to have, I think, is rather unclear. And this is happening against a very unusual background. As I mentioned, and as Raja mentioned, the rapid re-globalization of India's economy is one part of this, but you also have two powers in Asia rising very quickly at the same time, which is an unusual and destabilizing phenomenon historically. And in a sense, this comes down to how you think India is going to be able to balance its relationship with the US and China. The trend here seems to be pretty clear that relations between India and the US, if you think of how bad they were around the time of the scandal over Mrs. Khobragade 3 or 4 years ago, I mean, they've never been better than they are now. I mean, I think the notion that India is going to become some kind of non-treaty ally of the US is rather fanciful, but nonetheless, on a whole host of areas, relations with the US have improved dramatically. The indispensable partner was the phrase that Modi used in front of Congress. Well, I mean, the typical convention is to say that relations between India and China have this sort of, partly competition, partly cooperation dimension to them, where there's competition within the region and cooperation on areas of common interest like trade or climate change. But I think you've seen a pretty sort of unmistakable move towards more competition in the areas that were traditionally areas of cooperation of late, and that the sort of tensions between India and China have been growing. And that just sort of poses the question that I'll leave with, which is that the character of multilateralism that India wants, I think, is probably that's the question the Modi Doctrine, if there is one, is going to have to solve. And at the moment, that's not, to my mind anyway, that's not clear. So.